This is Black Market Leadership, the underground resource for disruptors and status quo breakers.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our series, the Mission Command series. Oh boy, I am really excited. Today, we are connecting Mission Command with John Boyd and the OODA Loop. And how are we doing this? Well, we have our normal guest here, Donald Vandergriff. Don, he is the author of the fantastic book, Adopting Mission Command, which you're going to see on the website. How you doing, Don?
I'm doing great. Fantastic to be here with you and a close friend and mentor, Dr. CHET RICHARDS, who I'm just thrilled to see him and his wife. His wife was just on here. I consider them close friends, and this is a great honor, and it's made my day.
Oh, I got to tell you before I get to Mr. CHET RICHARDS, for the audience here, there are certain books I read that I love, but there are certain books I call gems. And in fact, they're gems that I won't tell you what they are until you hire me as a coach. Well, Chet's book, Certain to Win, is a gem. So if you're out there listening to this, you got to get Certain to Win. I read this, and I think I read it several years ago, and I really didn't know much about John Boyd. I was blown away. So we, as our guests, have Mr. CHET RICHARDS. You're a protege of John Boyd. Are you also his intellectual heir?
Oh, by no means. Although obviously he influenced me quite a bit what I did, but there are a lot of people out there. Robert Coram in his book mentions his 6 acolytes, Pierre Spray now being recently deceased, unfortunately, but all the rest of those guys I think are still alive. And of course, Chuck Spinney is still active. Ray Leopold is still quite active, but he's active in other areas. And so all these guys are using John's ideas and going on. And there's another generation now, guys like Don Vandergriff, and there's another generation coming along behind him now, guys like you. And there's starting to be some really innovative work done out there to take John's framework into the future. As John pointed out, if all you want to do is just learn what he did, just forget it. What he wants is to pick up on these ideas and to the threads and to the patterns, as in patterns of conflict, and see where they apply and maybe don't apply as we go into the future. It's an ancient school of strategy. It can be traced directly back to Sun Tzu. But it's not just Sun Tzu brought into the 21st century. As John pointed out, an awful lot's happened since 500 BC. And so, but the basics, principles of how groups of humans in conflict with each other compete, and how they ensure that if you're one of those groups and it's either you or the other side, that if you can't figure out some kind of mutually acceptable relationship, it's going to be one or the other of you, then it's you. So, and that is basically, Boyd brought that school of thought into the late 20th century. And I think there's guys now who are taking, that gender neutral sense now into the 21st century. And we're making all kinds of interesting discoveries now in neuroscience and biology, how the human brain works and how human brains work when they're together with others in groups, and what conflict does and what stress does, and all this kind of how deception and ambiguity actually work. And so there's a lot of exciting work going on to carry these ideas into the future. So anyway,
so let me ask this. So for the audience here, just for the audience, as I mentioned earlier, I was introduced to John Boyd, I'm going to say 5 years ago. And my first impression was, what does an Air Force thinker have to do with the Army and Marine Corps, maneuver warfare, and mission command? So before we start this conversation, could you just give us a background on John Boyd? Who was he, and how does this lead to the OODA Loop?
Okay, basically, he was an Air Force fighter pilot, and over the course of a long career of being both a fighter pilot and an instructor out at the Air Force Fighter Weapons School, and watching, which gave him a chance to watch a whole bunch of different airplanes in action against each other. And it was mock combat, sort of like karate, but it was airplanes would get into a firing position, the gun camera showed they could have shot the other side down. So it was very realistic in that sense. Pilots were subjected to a lot of G's and the physical stresses. And what he discovered over a number of years was that it wasn't certainly the fastest airplane. that wins, because typically really fast airplanes like the SR-71 at the time took a long time to turn, and we didn't have any weapons that could reach way out from these very high-speed airplanes and shoot down an enemy fighter, an enemy bomber, perhaps. Tankers, transports, certainly, but not fighters. The results from Vietnam back that up. His first cut at the problem was, what we need is airplanes that can turn tighter, they can climb more quickly, and they can accelerate fast, and that led to the F-15. But then even further results, the airplanes flying against each other and getting reports from the pilots, seeing what the Israelis were able to report, because they were the only ally that we had that had a lot of modern experience against Soviet-type airplanes. And it became that we needed an airplane even more agile than an F-15, one that could not only turn more tightly, but could reverse its turn rate from one direction to another very, very quickly. It would seem to kind of flit around the sky. And it was that philosophy that led to the F-16. And then John got to thinking, he had a little contract with NASA that said, basically wrap all this stuff up for us and look at all the models we have and say which ones can handle this new type of air combat and which ones are still into the higher part, the faster. And as he was doing the research for that, the Israelis carried out the Entebbe raid in 1976.
Yeah.
And I recall, yeah. And he noticed, what was he was discovering that for airplanes, it was the guy in the cockpit that could handle the fastest rate that things were changing. And if your airplane was too complex, or if you couldn't see out, or if it was too sluggish to the controls, then you couldn't handle a fast rate of change. And he said, it was the same thing. If the Israelis could handle a fast rate of change on the ground, and the Ugandans and their advisors couldn't. And it just who would have thought the Entebbe raid and the fly off of the YF-16, YF-17 would be the same thing? But to John's mind, he saw that connection between them. It was rate of change, being able to create a very rapid rate of change and then be able to exploit it. Because a rapid rate of change can discombobulate the other side. It can disorient them. It can confuse them. And in that moment of confusion, if you operate quickly enough, you can attack and destroy the other side. And he put that in his conclusion to the NASA paper. It came out in September 1976. I'm pretty sure it's not what NASA was expecting, but it kind of led to the same thing. And then Pierre said, Entebbe raid's not the only land operations ever been carried out. Maybe you ought to look into land combat a little more, and got him into studying particularly the Blitzkrieg. Now, people say, well, why the Blitzkrieg? All right. The Blitzkrieg, in its pace of about 6 weeks, covered the same. They did more than that. It allowed triumph on the ground over the same land that 4 years of fighting, 20-something years earlier, had not. So you had stalemate in World War I for 4 years, and in World War II, you had a decision really in about 3 weeks. Well, you can't argue with it. Those are facts on the ground. And the French had more troops than the German, French and the British together, more forces than the German. They were on the defense, which according to classical military science is supposed to provide a huge advantage. They had more tanks than the Germans. On a one-on-one basis, and Don's a taker on this, he'll have to evaluate it, but most people say the German and French tanks were the French and British tanks were just as good as the German on the average.
Actually,
they were
better.
Cars, even better.
German tanks were better.
Yeah, because a lot of the German stuff, Panzerkampfwagen ones, they were in twos where they were basically armored cars, we call them today. Because remember, until Hitler came to power in 1933, the Germans had been subject to the Versailles Treaty. So up until 1933, they hadn't even been able to build any tanks, to develop tanks. So in 6 years, they put all that together, and they still really won the space of about 3 weeks. So that's absolutely amazing. That's hard to find examples like it. But when John started digging into it, what did the Germans do? What was their doctrine? How did it work? And he discovered a bunch of things. One thing is the doctrine they used went way back. It wasn't something they had just come up with on the spur of the moment. The roots of it go back early 1800s. I think you could easily trace it to, Don.
Well, the trace goes to Frederick the Great, but it was all in the Battle of Encirclement. Blitzkrieg was never a German word at all. It was a reporter's word from the UK. Gun and not a Glan, which is the battle of penetration, were all German terms, but there was nothing blitzkrieg at all. But the Germans never had a word for doctrine. They had philosophy and guidelines, and unlike our doctrine today and the French doctrine, which we copied from, none of their books were more than the thickest one was 83 pages, Truppenführer in 1933, which outlaid philosophy. It didn't outline. It was one of the best leadership books ever written. So the Germans wanted to protect the creativity and independence of their commanders, and they built an entire culture around that. Unlike us, who still today modeled after the industrial method, which is follow process, and if you conform to this process, you'll be successful, and it also lowers risk.
Which is the modern process. The process is right. The product is right. Is still, even under the Toyota production system, it's still the way modern industry works. And for most things, that works pretty well, because typically on a production line, you're not in direct competition with somebody on the other side who's shooting at you and trying to kill you. In fact, you want to make that environment inside the factory as stable as you possibly can, under control, as Deming talked about. Anyway, what Boyd found as he started digging into it was exactly what Don said. He found the Germans were able to create situations over and over again where they could essentially create and exploit chaos before the other side could figure it out. There were many times during that battle where the French, trying to do what they did in World War I, which is pull back a little bit, establish a new line. They would get to the spot where they were going to establish a new line, find the Germans were already there. And and you can imagine, so back in Paris, all these generals were, lecturing to each other and calling each other idiots, and drawing lines on the map, and had no clue what was going on. The German generals knew what was going on because they were up forward with the troops. They could see with their own eyes what was happening. They could see with their own eyes how demoralized the French were getting, that their own men, were capable of a lot more. They had tried the same general tactics in World War I, but it had broken down at the in the Easter offensive. So they thought they had fixed all those problems, and Germans could find out they had, in fact. And so their system was working. The Stukas were able to provide close air support and mobile fire support. The Germans were able to penetrate and exploit before the French could figure out what was going on. And so Boyd said it's that same idea of being able to handle the faster rate of change. And then he said, well, all right, let's go back into military history about as far as we can find good descriptions of the battles. So he went all the way back. He battled a marathon, I believe, was his first one. And the problem with a lot of these ancient battles, of course, is that descriptions of the battles weren't written down. But that's not as big a problem as you might think now, because back then, oral tradition was a lot better developed. Is that there were professional memorizers. People were used to memorizing. They had all kinds of techniques for memorizing complex things. So somebody who was at the battle, who told the story, the essence of that might well have been passed on down through several generations before it was written down. So it's not quite as bad as it sounds. And the basic tactics that they used, John found the same thing over and over again. The side that could create an instance of chaos, of very rapid change that the other side didn't expect, that could exploit the paralysis and the shock that confusion that produced in the other side, is the side that typically won. And it almost didn't make any difference what the size of the two forces were, which is interesting.
Can I throw this out? This is something that I've learned in when doing business strategy. I've learned that there's really two fundamental mindsets. And I ask this question: can you anticipate the future? If you say yes, then you fall into what they call a deliberate strategy, in a sense that we create a one lane, A, B, C, D, and E. There's a real emphasis on management because you're managing a process. But if you say you cannot anticipate the future, my understanding is you fall into what they call an emergent strategy. So instead of having that one lane, you have a highway. You have a general highway, maybe with 12 lanes in it. You're going to that end goal. But since you can't know what's in front of you, there's a huge emphasis on situational decision making, on being able to improvise. This sounds like what Boyd was really discovering from these battles? There's a real real premium on leaders on the ground to improvise and make it up as they go within the spirit of a general aim. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's what Boyd was talking about. Don, you have a thought on that?
I mean, when you say make it up, we got to be careful. I understand what you're saying, but because the reason I call my Facebook page Mission Command the Missing Link is people understand the extensive preparation the Prussians and then the Germans put their people through to be able for them to improvise. They already have vast experience in free play exercises, free play war games, and situations where from the moment they were a cadet, they were put under problems to figure out under a time limit with stress. And so, and only 5% made it total at the height. But the point is that they had an education and a manpower system, as the Marines call it, that was built around supporting the culture of optics tactic, which was not really used as a term until 1888, though Moltke the Elder and before him, of course, Frederick the Great, who court-martialed a lot of people, but never court-martialed a general for taking the initiative, even if he failed. So they built it. They understood that they had to have a culture of people taking responsibility. There's a 26-letter German word that I can spell it out, but I can't pronounce it. But it's talking about the strength of character, taking responsibility, seeking responsibility.
Responsibility.
The joy of responsibility. They had terms for that. We did not. Even now, our manuals are what's called the Army Training Pub 3.0, which talks about, and 6.0, which talks about 6.0 covers mission command. It's still 160 pages, and I swear to God, it's written by a council of lawyers. And the examples are all strategic operational level. They've got one sub-tactical about Sergeant York, which is not really a good example because what made Sergeant York was his upbringing and the fact that he was independent as a youth and young man. The U.S. Army didn't do it because if you review the approved lesson plans for training by John Pershing, most of them focused on rigid discipline and adherence to orders.
Great would have been proud.
Yeah. I mean, don't just away from Pershing what he did about the independence of the American Army and getting a 1 million-man army over there. But what people don't look at behind the scenes of the facade was a very top-down, strict, obedient disciplinarian who, again, fell for the industrial age, which was compliance to a process. And if you do the process, you're going to be successful. And as a result, we misunderstood that these people they weren't bad people or evil people, but they had a rigid system that hid the real reasons that we like won World War I, because we got in there a year with only a year left, and the Allies and Germans were already worn out, and particularly the Germans. And in World War II, we finally got in there by 42, 43, when the Russians were doing most of the killing. Because the other downfall of the German system, which people don't want to look at, is they thought with the great tactics and operational art, they didn't need a strategy. They were just going to win their way in battles through winning the war. So as Chuck Spinning likes to say, they tended to make enemies faster than they could kill them.
Good.
Yeah, when your grand strategy is based on the fact that we are the master race and everybody else is inferior, it's hard to attract a lot of people to your cause. So eventually, unless you win real quick, eventually you're going to have a problem. Yeah, that's exactly right. It all boils down to, I think, that if your basic idea is to create chaos and exploit it while the enemy is still in shock, then that's what you better train at. It's what you better have a doctrine for. It's what you better have a personnel system that supports. Whereas if your doctrine is basically we're going to trade firepower with the other side until you obliterate enough of them that they're forced to back up and maneuver, that's a completely different type of. And of course, in modern warfare, with the lethality of modern weapons, that second one is you may eventually win that way, but it's gonna kill an awful lot of people. So in fact, that was the problem with applying these tactics John was talking about, World War I tactics. Those are the same tactics Frederick the Great used. I mean, hell, the same tactics Alexander the Great used. But with the lethality of modern weapons, the casualty ratios just went up. And we had 1 million casualties. the Battle of the Somme in July 1916. Killed 40,000 Brits, as I recall, on the first day of that, the Black Day of the British Army. 40,000 gone in one day. And how far did they get? I don't remember, Dom. Mile, maybe?
They got a couple of kilometers in a couple of sectors, but if you look at the standing orders from the British High Command, it was basically attack with full kit, upright, in line formation, so they could have control, because they felt the artillery, which had incredibly defective ammunition, they didn't realize it did nothing to the German defenses. Whereas the Germans were slowly moving to a decentralized defense and offense. They were already working on the Strauss trooping tactics from 1914. They realized there was a problem. They didn't get there as fast as they wanted because there was two sides of the house, of course, the traditional linear side and then the decentralized side that was pushing the optics tactic. Fortunately for the Germans, though, the Moltke had his stamp on the education and creativity of the officer corps, so they were able to evolve a lot faster and innovate a lot faster than the Allies. Unfortunately, again, for the Germans, when you take on the whole world, even innovation is not enough. Even innovation is not enough to overcome numbers that eventually bleed you down.
So where does the OODA loop come in?
Let me throw up some charts from Boyd, and we will get to the OODA loop. So let me try this screen sharing here. I'm afraid every time it seems if I do this, if I hit play, I'll lose you. So I'm just going to leave. If y'all can see this chart, I'm just going to leave it like this.
Yeah, it's great.
We'll go down through. This is the first paragraph of John's abstract. He wrote it in 1989 after he had finished the great bulk of the work that he published that became the Discourse on Winning and Losing. So his famous briefing, Patterns of Conflict, was already finished. It finished in 1986. In fact, after this, I think he only did like 45 more charts. But basically, he didn't change anything after this. This was still his philosophy. He says the idea is that we have to make intuitive within ourselves. But this has a number of implications. For one thing, it says that we're not just sitting around and waiting for orders. If it's intuitive within ourselves, that's fundamental to being able to take the initiative. Because if it's not intuitive, then you've got to sit down, you have to discuss, you have to coordinate, you have to do analysis to try to figure out what it is you're going to do. All that stuff takes time. It pumps up friction, and particularly in a fast-breaking situation, the solution you come up with tends to be out of date. So he said, really, all you can really use in a fast-breaking conflict type situation is what we have intuitive within ourselves. And so that's the key. We will develop new stuff as time goes along. But if we don't, for example, have a good feel for how to operate in a complex environment of what creating chaos and exploiting it actually means, how to determine when the enemy is actually breaking and it's time to exploit, all the kind of stuff Don talks about. If we haven't gotten that down into where we have what the Germans call Fingerspitzengefühl, fingertip feeling, an intuitive feel for it, then we're not going to be able to use it when the crunch hits. So he has a big thing on being able to make stuff to where we can use it even in a confused, rapidly breaking and stressful situation. He said, all right, now we'll jump to the very end of Patterns of Conflict. There's only about, I think, 8 more charts to go after this. And the important thing here is it points out 4 properties that John came across time after time after time of organizations that could win and win consistently in any type of situation. They're variety and rapidity, harmony and initiative, variety and rapidity on the outside. Variety, of course, so that you don't become a one-trick pony, you become unpredictable. But also, variety gives you a number of resources that you can use to play the deception and ambiguity game. And we do this by having harmony and initiative on our own side. That's the stuff that Don is talking about with his outcome-based learning, as I understand it, is that gives you organizations that have harmony, because people have all been trained in this thing, and they are trained to take the initiative, not to wait for orders, to be able to, they have this intuitive sense that they know when it's time to take the initiative. They can look at each other, and with a nod of the head or a wave of the hand, they all know exactly what to do. And so they can very, 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 very quickly do it. And so it's those 4 properties. And as he said down here, if you have these 4 properties, then you can operate inside the other side's OODA loop. Don't worry about what that means right now, but the effect of it means that you can make things happen to the other side faster than they can figure it out. And so they're going to become confused. They're going to be like the French generals in World War I. We could talk about perhaps some of the American top leaders more recently than that. And they're going to bicker among themselves. They're going to argue. They're not going to be able to take effective action. Once they finally decide something to do, it's going to be too late. The other side will have figured out and gone on. And then down on the very bottom down there, he said, furthermore, and now we get into if you make enemies faster than you can kill them, you're going to have a problem. You want to do this in a way that attracts the uncommitted to your cause. And that to me was where the bridge over to the business world becomes, because basically you should always regard the customers as uncommitted. They're the people you want to attract to your cause.
Yes.
They want to get them to spend money. Yeah, don't ever regard the customer as committed. Very, very, very bad mistake. The customer can always go somewhere else. You always have to keep attracting them to your cause. And oddly enough, Boyd, although he didn't know screw all about business and been the first to admit it, it's that same idea there. And so he said, while you're beating the hell out of your current opponents, you're always building your own morale. You're building your own set of allies. You're trying to get the uncommitted to, even if they don't come in on your side, not to actively help the other side, and so on. As I point out, as long as we stick to what we here in the United States were founded on, things like the Constitution and our freedom, our free enterprise society, that is extremely attractive around the world. There are very few people that are organizing caravans to break into North Korea, for example, or as far as I know, into Iran. So we have the natural tools for doing this if we will use them. If we will mate that with the stuff that Don and his cohorts are doing to make our military more effective when we do need to use it. To me, that's a winning formula for a long time to come. So there's a lot of stuff that Boyd did here back, coming up on 40 years ago, 35 years ago. It seems to me to be just as applicable today as it ever was.
It's amazing.
Moving right along, what that allows you to do. Now, see, here's the interesting chart here. His impression of the Blitzkrieg, and he's talking about multiple thrusts. But the really interesting thing, I don't know if you can see my cursor moving here. You see these little elbows. Look at how they can't be predicted in advance. What this is forces coming up, encountering the enemy, and then using the kind of stuff Don talks about to maybe fix the enemy in place while you go around his flank. But they're doing it in the present moment, almost in real time. There's not enough time for this to work if they've got to go back through their chain of command, back to some general sitting back here, and then orders come back. By this time, these guys have figured out what's going on. They're doing something else. They may be getting ready to attack you in the flank or something. You're giving them time at least to recover from the shock. Whereas if you can engage them, and while they're still confused about what's going on, do something, then you get a real advantage. But you've got to, again, coming back to the work that Don is doing, you've got to be trained, and you've got to have a force designed and with the personnel policy in place and all of that to produce forces that can actually do it. And that's what you're really seeing here. This is the example of people out in the field taking the initiative while other people are shooting at them, kind of thing. And so that's what Boyd is really, is really talking about. That's to his extent, that's what made the Blitzkrieg work. A lot of other stuff that went on, but it was that putting together a force that could do that. So to get over into the OODA loop, again, he did a lot more thinking about it, did a lot more presentations, and he started to boil it down. And he said, all right, it isn't so much our intuitive responses. We need that so that we can take the initiative. But what's really is important is acting together as groups of people, that our cohesion doesn't break down, that we can act in a way that preserves the initiative of the people that's in there, but still accomplishes the overall purpose of our operation, what it is we're trying to accomplish. But we do it at the same time by pumping up the initiative, because you don't know who's going to spot the thing that breaks it open. Who's going to have the great idea, who's going to have for example, in the Toyota production system and the Kanban, who's going to have that brilliant idea, that speeds up the manufacture of the car by 15 minutes and saves $1,000 and over 1 million cars? That's real money, and it's the same thing here. So he said it's that ability to operate in an implicit way to where we don't have to have written orders for everything that we do. We certainly don't have to go back to headquarters for orders at everything we do. We need this stuff that we can carry out, on our own through actions and changes that have been previously experienced. Then he goes to da 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 da, and the many-sided and cross-referencing process. That's his description of orientation. Now, in John's view of the universe, what we have inside our brains here is a mental model of the universe, external as well as internal. And what that mental model is actually doing is it's making predictions. So we're talking about being able to predict the future. You absolutely have to be able to predict the future, in the sense that you have to be able to predict the results of what our actions, as we take actions, what are the results of those actions going to be? Are they heading us in a direction that we want to go? And that's where that previous experience comes in. That's where leadership comes from. That's where commanders that have worked their way up through the system and both succeeded and failed and learned what worked and what didn't in all these various different things, and that have the initiative to seize the moment. That's where all of that sort of stuff comes in. That's your mental model, and modern neuroscience is confirming a lot of that. A functional MRI is actually locating areas in the brain, not just the prefrontal cortex, but all throughout the brain that play into this process. Now, if you have a mental model that predicts the future, and I have a mental model that predicts the future, and we're in a conflict together, Kevin, and one or the other of us is going to win, and my mental model is making more accurate predictions of the future than yours, guess who's going to win? Yeah, well, I have a big advantage. I still need to have actions that I can use, but you're at a huge disadvantage. You're always not going to be reacting to me. And I'm going to be able to predict, because I know if I come at you like this, you're going to back up and throw up that. If I see that about 3 times, I'm going to fake it. I'm going to come. That's a very simple way, but that's the kind of thing. But it's a thing. Toyota was able to predict what General Motors was going to do really, really easily. For one thing, it took them twice as long to do it, but they knew, they were going. The cheap stuff, their less expensive cars are going to really be cheap and badly built, and their good stuff was going to be way too expensive and use way too much gasoline. Very, very simple. And so when the Arab oil embargo hit, first one in 1973, kablam! At that point, it was basically all over for Detroit. It took Detroit another embargo in 1979, the fall of the Shah, before the final hammer was driven in, nail was driven in, but that's basically what happened. So this idea of a mental model is, okay, we're not just sitting here gazing at our neighbor. What we're doing is our mental model is making predictions about the world. That's the projection thing. And based on what is happening with that projection, in the empathy part, we're sensing, not just seeing, but through a variety of mechanisms, sensing the results of our actions. And then we're looking at what worked and what didn't, correlation and rejected. We are tweaking our mental model. The mental model is not a set of equations. It's more like one of these things from science fiction where you look down and it's going all the time. It's a little model of the universe there, and you say, this isn't quite right here. Let's tweak that a little bit over there, kind of thing. Aha, sort of a thing. So you're always tweaking your mental model. Sometimes you may have to make a big tweak, a paradigm shift, but for the purposes of this, we can talk. He says, well, how do you do that? Well, partly it's analysis and synthesis. John was an engineer. He was a great believer in numerical techniques where they applied. His stuff with energy maneuverability was all straight numerical, and even the stuff with the F-16, where he was getting into putting the human in the cockpit, trying to see who got confused and who didn't. They were still trying to quantify as much as they could. And then you come up with an idea, synthesis. Aha, well, it seems to me like what we need to do is kablam. And that's your synthesis. You go try that, and it goes through the process of cross-projection, empathy, and all of that. And that works really, really well, except that it's a little slow. And that's where that implicit repertoire up here, what this allows you to do is to develop new implicit repertoire and to tweak your orientation to use it. So you have an implicit repertoire all along, but as you get to engagement, you have to use it, you have to learn from it, you have to tweak it, you have to improve your orientation of what the other side is doing, your predictions of what the other side is going to do, and on and on and on. And he finally drew a sketch on all that. And that brings us to the famous OODA loop. First thing to notice is it's not a loop. Well, it's not a simple loop. It's a lot of loops. But you can break it down pretty simple. Look at this. We call this the main axis right here. It's what we just said. You do all this stuff out there, and you try something. You come up with an idea. You try it. You see how that worked. You revise. You do all this stuff in here. You do your revisions in here. You come up with some new stuff that you try, and you go through the loop. By the way, one of the German doctrine that one of the generals told Bach was that the really good blitzkrieg commanders, they had a saying: if you try something and it doesn't work, try something else. If you try something and it does work, do something else, because the enemy will figure you out. So you're always coming up. You always have to innovate, but you have to innovate in a way that your organization can carry that out without say, well, could you draw that out for me? Could you explain that? Not enough time for that crap. So see, there's the stuff that Don was talking about, this being able to develop the sense of being able to do that kind of stuff. Most of the time, this is that implicit repertoire is actions that you can activate via this implicit guidance and control. They come directly out of orientation. And again, that's becoming quite well accepted in certain areas. You're probably familiar with recognition prime decision making. It's very similar in that sense to what Boyd was, pattern recognition sort of things. It's kind of that same idea. Once you sort of figure out what pattern is going on there, then you can come up with things you can do about it. And if you don't have something that you can do about it, then you kind of have to use what you have until you can develop something. In other words, if you get into action and you say, well, gee, it would be really nice if we had a gun that could fire around corners, but since we don't, what are we going to do with what we have today? And the OODA loop is supposed to encompass all of that. So this is how you tweak your orientation through hypothesis and test and back through observation. This is your primary way you trigger actions, is up here. And there may be cases where you have to use this explicit decision, but if you do, be advised that it's liable to be slow, and also because you can't use implicit means that it's likely to be misunderstood by a lot of people. There may be times when you have to use it, but you really want, as much as possible, train yourself to use this one up here.
So let me say
over here. This is the drinking your own bathwater loop here, and we can talk about that some other time. Incestuous amplification.
So, just for one point of clarification, you mentioned the explicit direction. That's almost like getting a written order versus the implicit doing it on the spot.
A verbal order can be explicit too, but. And Don can go in more detail on this. Typically, you want your verbal orders to be very short and very concise, which means that most of what you need to tell them is already implicit in them through their previous training and experience. Also, all you really need to do is point, nod your heads, get you'll take out a map and point to something kind of everybody looking over their shoulder says, oh, okay, we got it now. And let's go do it. Let's go make it happen, sort of thing. Mike Wiley said you get a really, really good group. A lot of that action happens organically, and the role of the commander essentially becomes to keep the pot boiling and to keep higher headquarters away from the action going on. Like he said, keep the guys in the helicopter above you out of the fight. Is how he described it, because you guys have done it often enough now and together, and they're well trained enough, and they can read each other well enough that they can feel when things are starting to break, and so they know what to do. So a lot of what he did was try to be at the front and just encourage people to keep going. You may remember Patton in the movie Patton, where he's standing at that intersection, directing traffic. As I recall, that actually happened, and more than once. That was very much of a Patton-esque, as opposed to sitting back in the chateau, getting dispatches. So that's the OODA loop. It's a combination of learning learning new stuff, and constantly improving your orientation, trying to have an orientation advantage over your opponent, and most of the time implementing actions via implicit guidance and control. Now, there's a couple of things cultural-wise. In fact, there's several things cultural-wise, and this is where I'm really going to tread on Don's toes for a minute, but only in the sense that I'm going to say what John thought about it. A lot of what he did, remember, it's 35, 40 years ago, so they well have been overtaken by events. But he said, basically, the way that you do this, look at this at the second bullet down here, was by interacting together. So that they create, and remember, this is orientation. This is our mental model down here. And he called it a similar implicit orientation. Now, let me go back to the OODA loop for just a second, and I'll explain that. Look at the OODA loop here. Look what's inside orientation. Groups don't have genetic heritage. People have genetic heritage. It's in their DNA and in the epigenetic material, all that stuff we're learning about now. That's what he was talking. This is essentially what's wired. And all Boyd said is people are different. Some people, just because we're wired differently, people are different, and you use what you got. So when you try to put this in a group setting, you got to be real careful with genetic heritage, because now it's beginning to sound like Aryan superiority. That's not what John meant by it at all. When you get to a group setting, you need to kind of forget what's inside the box and go over and look at this implicit guidance and control thing. That's what you're going for now, is implicit guidance and control. And he said, all you really want is through this, leaders and subordinate alike given opportunities to interact with each other to produce a similar implicit orientation. Regardless of what our orientations are, we want an implicit orientation for the whole group made up of similar, but not identical, similar orientations among the individuals. So you can bring those orientations among the individuals close. So you can control some previous experiences through that, what we just said, through this thing here. You can't do anything about genetic heritage. You can do a lot about the new information that they have. And, they bring their cultural traditions with them, and you can exploit that or work around them as you need, depending on your understanding. The Germans, pretty homogeneous, not as homogeneous as a lot of Americans like to believe, because Germans regard themselves as a bunch of wild and crazy guys. You can see a little of that today with the reaction to the vaccination campaigns. We look at them as, goose step marching and all that. That's not how they see themselves at all. So if you're going to work in an organization with a lot of Germans, you need to understand their cultural traditions. And so that's all Boyd is saying here. And that allows you to get inside the loop.
The cultural heritage element, could that be synonymous with grouping, people who are born in the Southwest versus people born in the Deep South versus the Northeast? Could it be something, those kind of similar conditions? Versus
John, it can be, but you got to be so careful, because even those of us born in Mississippi, my wife and I both born in, we see each other as quite a bit different. She's from the Delta, her dad owned a cotton farm, kind of thing. We were up in the hills with Don's relatives, a fair number of mine hiding out from the Civil War. People don't realize that every state in the Union except South Carolina sent at least one company-sized unit to fight for the North. At least that's what Shelby Foote said. But there's a Union County in Mississippi. I think there was a movie or a miniseries or something, County of Jones, something like that. Yeah, that actually happened. There was not, and Virginia almost didn't join the Confederacy. It was really close. And as I recall, they were the last state. It was really, really close to them to be at least neutral. In the end, of course, they did go in. But so that's all he's talking about there. But regardless of what makes up orientation, if you can make the orientation similar enough so that it looks from the outside as if your whole organization had kind of an implicit orientation, and in meanwhile, basically in that they now can take action very quickly without needing a lot of explicit orders and a lot of instructions. They can create and exploit opportunities. They're trained to do that. They use the initiative to seek out cracks, and then shoot through that sort of stuff, the kind of thing Strauss-Tricken talked about, whatever that Don. Yeah. So how do you do it? Well, Boyd came up with this catchy little phrase that for some reason hasn't caught on in modern military doctrine and jargon. But all he really means here is cohesion. The German term is Einheit, means literally translate as oneness, means unity. It means a unit as an Einheit. And you can see the kind of things in the second paragraph here. Don was talking about only the 5% made it through. That's what he's talking about up here. The body of professional officers received exactly the training. About 5% made it all the way through. Now, everybody that started it got a lot out of it, but only 5% got that the general staff tab. Really, really, really tough. But everybody that kind of got into it learned a lot from it. But what it does, look down here, a very, very great measure of freedom of action and freedom in the manner, which primarily calls for independent, daring, initiative, and sense of responsibility, which Don mentioned. And as I understand the German culture, these weren't just buzzwords. They actually had words for it. They had ways of doctrinating. And when they were rating subordinates, they rated them along these lines. And this process, sticking with the process does not appear in this list here. It does not mean that it's not important to understand how to do things. That's the Fingerspitzengefühl. But if you have a process, that means that the enemy may be able to figure out what your process is and exploit it. Very famous expression, Duke of Wellington. Duke of Wellington defeated every one of Napoleon's marshals that were thrown at him, and then he defeated Napoleon with an army that was kludged together at basically the last minute. And after the battle, somebody asked him, basically what you did, and the Duke said, "Well, actually, it was quite simple. Napoleon came on in the same old way, and we beat him in the same old way." John Keegan, by the way, has that thing. And if you study the Battle of Waterloo, that's basically what he did. So Napoleon, for all of his great benefits and virtue, made himself predictable to Wellington, and Wellington was able to exploit a lot of other stuff. The Prussians, of course, played a crucial role in that battle, and a lot of other stuff happened. But that was the basic idea. So now here's the big thing down here. Common outlook is the same as a similar implicit orientation. This is an earlier version of that chart. If you have it, you can simultaneously encourage subordinate initiative, yet realize superior intent. In other words, you're not herding cats. You can give people lots of freedom and they can use their creativity and initiative, but it is in a way that they accomplish the objective. They accomplish the mission. They accomplish the intent of the superior. And that's the real magic into all of this. So I like to say what John is all about in any field of human endeavor is he's about firing up the creativity and initiative of everybody in the organization and harmonizing that to accomplish the purposes of the organization. Sounds so simple, but as John will tell you, it requires a lot of training, it requires a lot of hard work, it requires an overall system that buys into that and to support that knowledge. And so this is the idea here is, okay, once we have everybody together, then there are a couple of tools that we can use so that we take all that creativity and initiative and actually harmonize it. And the two that John talks about are mission and Schwerpunkt. And this is mission, and it's I guess part of Auftragstaktik. So you thought of as a contract in German. An Auftrag is a form of a contract, and you can kind of read down through it.
This is amazing. I just got to tell you, this is fascinating because what I'm seeing from, or what I'm hearing from you is, the OODA loop, especially the orientation. You are developing your mind in order to cohere with reality, so you can adjust to a reality, and you're developing those patterns.
Just reality. That's the other thing. You are creating reality as you go along. The better you match up with reality now, the more able you are then to tweak it the way you want it to go. And so we're predicting the future, but maybe only in a conflict, maybe only seconds or fractions of a second ahead of us. In business, it's probably, depending on what business you're in, it may be several years, maybe months. In the information technology industry, maybe weeks. But so we're not doing a long-term roadmap to the future. What we're basically saying, okay, we're going to the Emerald City, and there it is over there somewhere. Well, we can't draw you a map of how to get to it because there's people in between trying to keep us from getting there. But But our first step is let's try this and see what happens. Then we'll try that and see what happens. We'll learn from those two. Now we'll try this and see what happens. And if you keep that up, keep learning, keep tweaking, keep making your own organization better, keep developing tools that you need as you go along, you will eventually get there. And although you look back on it and say, boy, that isn't what I had in mind at all. In fact, it's not even the same Emerald City I thought we were going to. But here we are. We're a unicorn, $5 billion company. Customers love us. What the hell, we got there.
The one thing that I just got the one thing that I have found, you mentioned about business. I see the value in this in that it helps prevent chaos internally. The fact that you can get people together and prevent it from, you're not fighting competitor head to head, but you're making sure that you don't fragment on the way to your final objective.
Very, very perceptive comment. And I'd just like to point out that a lot of the techniques that Don comes up with have nothing to do with war. They're basically getting organizations to work just like you said. So in that sense, but it requires a lot. If you think about how Toyota worked before about 2005 or 6 or so, when they had a period in there where they focused on growth and had arbitrary growth targets where they wanted to make 10 million vehicles a year, no matter how good they were. Before that, their philosophy was every year we just want to be better than we were the year before. And we want to keep refining our system, and we want to keep driving out waste, and we want to keep, harmonizing better, learning more about our customer and all that. And we don't care how many we make. We'll make as many as we can, but we're not going to make more than we can make that it fits in with that. It was not going to make a million cars that don't live up to our expectations just to say we can make 10. They got away from that in the early 2000s. The president of Toyota at that time, who was not a member of the Toyota family, actually had to bow to the Japanese prime minister and apologized. Consumer Reports actually for a while there took Toyota off of its list of uniformly recommended brands. And it wasn't until Akio Toyota came back in and a family member got them back onto the right track that they were able to return to where they are today. Now, here's the key point. Before that period of time, they spent a humongous amount of time training people. It went something like this. You had to go at your own expense through programs at various community colleges. For example, if you wanted to work up in Kentucky at their plant. And then once you graduated from that and had the basic skills, then you went through a selection process. If you were selected at that point, you went on the Toyota payroll, but you still had I think it was 12-week program that you went through, which coincidentally is almost the same length of time as Marine Corps basic training, where they basically taught you the system. At the end of that thing, there was another evaluation where they either then said, well, that was really nice, but sorry, goodbye, or they then put you out on the factory floor in kind of an internship relationship. So then this long period of time where you actually studied and learned, and you learned their system. Then you got together with the group you're going to be working with as an intern and learned that system. And if you compare that with at Lockheed, when I was there, they basically, their philosophy was, we don't give you any training. We hired you for the skills, and get on the factory floor and go to work. That's what we hired you for. You're supposed to already have these skills, which was, it was all the aircraft companies at that time.
If you look at the U.S. military, they have that same philosophy. They see formal education as an aberration. Matter of fact, now they want to move to this online system. And online has a place, but as we've discovered, it has to be a mix. So the U.S. military, even going away to school or something, is seen as a career progression versus a professionalism. So they even connect a negative. And a lot of it's their own fault because they've maintained, even now, despite the moves of General Mullen that I consulted for 2 years recently, to move to all the stuff Chet mentioned about what we know about learning through Dr. Bork at UCLA and a better analysis of military history. The Germans, even in Moltke's time, well, he finally gets the system down pat right prior to the Franco-Prussian War in the 70s, 1870s, and 88s and 90s. Their system was far superior to what we have now. We are still in a mass production system, and then when you tangle that with political correctness and the equity and all that stuff without regards to, I just want the best person. I don't care what they look like and what sex they are. I don't care. Then you really water down and you really go back to the industrial age system, and that makes the concept. See, I think John did not get on the optics tactic because it was, and he focused on Schwerpunkt. When all the work I've seen and all your writings, and thank you again, Chet was a big influence on the German chapter that you just read about, Kevin, or the John Boyd chapter, the lead chapter in the book, which I acquired through these slides and stuff and reading all of John's stuff at Quantico. I think Schwerpunkt is mentioned a lot earlier and more frequently than optics tactic. Even though the Germans started talking about optics tactic after Moltke took over, it was just a big philosophical, cultural thing. It was not well defined. It wasn't even well defined until 1905 in the field regulations. So what John was able to find out about it at his time was very limited, and there was more things about Schwerpunkt, the point of effort, but it was optics tactic that enabled Schwerpunkt.
Yes,
Because
that's exactly right. Exactly right. And I think part of the reason for that is, like you say, there wasn't that much out on it at the time. The German generals that he talked about were more at that very high level. He only had the opportunity to interview, I think, 2 or 3 of them. And they were more interested in Schwerpunkt because, well, look down here. Auftragtaktik is one superior in this sense to a subordinate. So you're giving a mission to a subordinate. There's negotiation and all of that back and forth. But basically, it's superior subordinate. This is your mission. Go do it. And once you accept the mission, then you figure out how to make it done, as long as you stick within the rules that we've agreed on, so that you don't get over in somebody else's area and get yourself friendly fire incident, and that you employ the doctrine that has been trained into for many, many years. And to give a business example, if a person has a mission to improve a particular thing in Toyota that has been causing them problems or causing them to fall behind the competition, one of the things they are not allowed to do to improve it is build inventory, build stock. They have to use the principles of the Toyota production system so that it fits in with the rest of the system. But anyway, that's one superior to one subordinate. What Schwerpunkt now is how you deal with an entire group. So we've got our entire group all fired up, creativity and initiative. We can use superior or subordinate to assign specific missions to specific people. But typically that's going to be very slow if you've got 7 or 8 or 10 or whatever, depending on how many subordinates you have. And in modern business, 7 or 8 is not unusual. In war, maybe 2 or 3 a corps commander and have 2 or 3 divisions under him. It's still slow, and all 3 of them got to kind of look over each other's shoulder. Schwerpunkt allows you to go around that, because with the Schwerpunkt, as you can see here, the idea is that you explain the overall most important parts of the mission. In fact, Mike Wally just said, what's the most important thing going on in the battlefield right now? Or Stephen Bungay, the British author, entitled the chapter he has on Schwerpunkt, I think he calls it Schwerpunkt, but he titled the chapter, he said, tell me what you want, what you really, really want, which of course is a line from a Spice Girls song. I love that. Tell me what you, okay, forget all that other crap. What is it you're really trying to accomplish? When shit hits the fan, and I'm not sure exactly what to do, what should I do? And you can easily put that into a battlefield situation. Don can put you into that much better than I can.
The greatest example of that is at the Muse on 14 May.
Oh, he cut out.
I
think I read it.
It was World War II and on the Western Front.
Yeah, because I'm just finishing adopting mission command. I think he's referring to was it 2 or 3 corps or 2 or 3 German armies, and it comes down.
You had a Panzer Group Kleist, and it was attacking across the Meuse, and it came down to basically one regiment headed by
one regiment got all the air group, got all the artillery, got everything, and because the Germans said that's where we're going to achieve the decision at Sedan. And everyone else is going to support it. It doesn't mean the Schwerpunkt cannot change, it can, but it's where you want to achieve a decision. Now, we use the term main effort, but main effort is a weighted thing where you may get a little more of somebody else. We don't.
Uh-oh, he's cutting out.
No, he's exactly right. And the idea there was it's main effort in a mental sense. For example, a common way of taking a castle back during the Middle Ages was to find a latrine, work your way up through it, pry the bars open, and they knew that. But some of the people maybe weren't that really quite good at watching over the latrine. Now, all the latrine was an open hole going down the side of the castle. And in some cases, it was possible, in fact, to worm your way up through that, pry the bars open, get into the castle, go around and open the door. So let's suppose that's our concept of operations. Okay, how are we going to make it work? We got to cause a lot of other effort all around the castle. We got to throw rocks at it with our catapults and ballistas. We got to shoot arrows. We got to have people with ladders, climbing up. And the whole purpose of that is to focus their attention away from the Schwerpunkt, which is that one guy going up through a latrine, prying a bar open, sliding through it, usually pretty well greased at that point, and going to come around, and while everybody else is focused, open a door and start letting people in. So the Schwerpunkt in that case was one person, and the other, all 40 other thousand people effort was to do whatever they could to ensure that one person succeeded. So that's I think people can visualize that one pretty well.
That's a great one. That's a great example.
Yeah, I got that from, I think, what was it, The Name of the Rose? But that actually was. I was watching a series called Time Team and they actually went to some castles that, during the War of the Roses, or maybe even back earlier than that, in Roman times, where that tactic was used. But it's the most important, but it's an idea really, and it's that everything. So if things get really confused, you close your eyes and kind of think, okay, what is the most important idea, and what can I do now to make the biggest contribution toward it? So if communications cut off, as far as you know, the commander may have been killed. You don't know what's going on. You may have lost communications with on your side, but one thing you cannot do is sit and wait for orders. Do something. What do? You do what, in your opinion, best accomplishes the purpose of the Schwerpunkt. And Don, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Germans had a big thing of never punishing somebody for if they did that, for doing something that they regarded as the wrong thing to do.
And see the way you bond this is when we were talking about few people made German officer. We have a big strata system, whereas like you and I have talked about, Kevin, you only succeed on our system if you make a certain rank and you hold certain titles. In the German system, they made it so hard to be a leader because leadership was so important. It was their top resource. Realized early on they didn't have anything else because they were surrounded and they were resource poor. But just making the commission of a second lieutenant was upheld as a big thing. So you diminished a lot of the careerism that comes in our system, where you have 5 or 4 sources of being a lieutenant. It's based on a civilian degree largely, and the military.
Oh, he cut off.
Yeah, in fact, the Marines now are calling about commissioning people even at the middle ranks who have no military experience just because they want their IT or cyber or whatever. Thinking, what a bad idea.
Wow.
That's what contractors are for. If you need a specific technical skill, bring them in as civilians, pay them whatever that it takes, but don't let them pin on the Eagle, Globe, and Anchor because, and I'm not a Marine. Don has been a Marine, but that means that you have bled, you have been through the training, you have shown that you have what it takes. Give them something else. Let them be, Marine Corps IT, cyber people or whatever. But
our whole system is based on the premise of.
Oh man, poor Don.
Yeah. Let me go on to my very, very last chart here. Wraps everything up. I love this one right here. You can read about the Schwerpunkt Mission Auftragstaktik, implicit over explicit, which we talked about. This is a good one. Lies on what is unstated or not communicated. He got this idea, I think, from Martin Van Creveld, who makes a big deal out of it, Command and War. I'm sure John had it all along. It kind of crystallized with that. And as he once pointed out, if you don't communicate something, then your communication can't be misunderstood. It can't be garbled. It can't be intercepted by the enemy. So if you can communicate with not communicating, you can get your ideas across without communicating. Well, how do you do that? Well, you do it using the things that we've talked about here. The overall mind time space scheme, Einheit, the mutual training that we have together, the experiences we have together, and then out through Auftrag and Schwerpunkt. We do a lot of this communicating in a way that's not only very, very fast, it's much less likely to be understood, and it's impossible to be intercepted by the enemy. So as a result, you read that last line, and the board really liked that. He did not interview Blumentritt, by the way. I believe this is from, what's his name's book on the German general's talk.
Hart.
Yeah.
Liddell Hart.
Yeah, Liddell Hart. Because Blumentritt and he references a Liddell Hart's book in there. But that is operating inside the OODA loop.
It's amazing. Thank you for sharing these slides. This is amazing. This really is. Boy, what a great conversation.
Thank you. All of the charts are available, by the way, on my blog, slightly.eastofnew.com. It's all one word, run together. It's a WordPress blog, so it may show up in your thing. It's fasttransients.com, slightly east of New, and they're all available for free download. All of Boyd's stuff is, and all of my stuff, most of my stuff is available for free download on that site. So, your viewers are encouraged and more than welcome to go over and download and use that stuff for whatever purposes they'd like.
I'm sure they will. And again, certain to win. Gem. It's an absolute gem. Certain to win.
Yeah. I should point out that the phrase comes from the, I believe it's the Griffith translation. General Griffith was a Marine Corps general and went and got his PhD at Oxford and did a beautiful translation of Sun Tzu. And that's from his translation of Sun Tzu. A general who uses my techniques is certain to win. Employ him. So he wasn't making it. If you read the book, you understand why.
It's a fantastic book. It's and just I'm always a big fan of people who can write. Kudos to you for it is succinct to the point. It's not War and Peace, but boy, there's so much information in it. So kudos to you.
Really, as a practitioner of this sort of thing, I really do appreciate that coming from you. Thank you.
Thank you. If you like this content and want to hear other things like it, head on over to the website at blackmarketleadership.com. That's blackmarketleadership.com. There you can subscribe to the podcast, and you can even create a free members profile